Philosophy, as a field where humanity seeks answers to existential, ethical and epistemological questions, despite being a universal pursuit, has mostly been known through the names of men throughout history. The scarcity of women philosophers is not just explained by a lack of individual talent or interest, but by historical, social and cultural barriers. In this video, we will delve into the invisibility of women philosophers in the history of philosophy and the reasons behind this situation. And we will evaluate the contributions of women thinkers to history and their overlooked legacies. The most fundamental reason for the exclusion of women from philosophical production is that they have been deprived of the right to education throughout history. Since philosophy is a discipline directly related to education, women first needed access to knowledge to make their voices heard in this field. However, male-dominated education systems, starting from ancient Greece, education was seen as a privilege for men. For example, although Plato defended the intellectual equality of women in his work, The Republic, even in this ideal society, women had limited access to education. From the Middle Ages onwards, universities only accepted men, and women were generally limited to church or monastery-based education. These obstacles made women's intellectual development dependent on individual efforts and limited resources. Hildegard von Bingen pushed the boundaries of her time by writing mystical and theological texts, even within these limitations. However, figures like her were considered exceptions. Even when women philosophers had the opportunity to express and publish their thoughts, they remained in the shadow of their male colleagues. For example, Anne Conway inspired Leibniz with her monad-like metaphysical system, but her contributions were often seen as an extension of Leibniz's ideas. However, Conway's work, The Principles of the Most Ancient and Modern Philosophy, is an example of independent metaphysical thought. Simone de Beauvoir, in the 20th century, with her work The Second Sex, which is the cornerstone of feminist philosophy, she questioned the social and intellectual identities of women. But even Beauvoir was remembered in the shadow of Jean-Paul Sartre for many years. This situation has led to women philosophers not finding enough space in the writing of history. History has mostly highlighted the achievements of men, either ignoring or downplaying the contributions of women. Religion has played a restrictive role in women's intellectual activities in many periods. In medieval Europe, the Church mostly associated women with spiritual and domestic roles. Mysticism and women like Hildegard von Bingen and Mechthild of Magdeburg, developed philosophical thoughts through religious mysticism. However, these thoughts were generally evaluated within a theological context and were not carried into a philosophical discussion area. In the Islamic world, alongside great Islamic philosophers like Ibn Sina and Farabi, there were also women thinkers, but most of them couldn't even find a name in historical records. For example, figures like Fatima al-Fihri, even though they played key roles in accessing and disseminating knowledge, were generally left in the background. Women expressed their philosophical thoughts not directly in the field of philosophy, but through more acceptable fields like literature, art and theology. Mary Wollstonecraft made significant contributions to Enlightenment thought, especially with her work A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, which laid the foundations of feminist philosophy. George Eliot, Mary Ann Evans. Through literature, she offered deep philosophical critiques of the understanding of morality and freedom of the time. These fields allowed women to express their philosophical thoughts indirectly. The more visible place of women in philosophy became possible with the feminist movements that started in the 19th and 20th centuries. Women no longer just questioned social roles, but also played an active role in rewriting the history of philosophy. Hannah Arendt became one of the most important names in contemporary philosophy with her work on totalitarianism and the human condition in the field of political philosophy. Iris Murdoch. Her works at the intersection of moral philosophy and literature deeply questioned the relationship between the individual and society. In this period, women philosophers not only made their existence accepted, but also pioneered new philosophical movements. The reason why women philosophers have been rarely seen throughout history is not due to a lack of intellectual competence, but because social and historical conditions limited them. Today, even though the thoughts of women philosophers are more widely appreciated, this history needs to be rewritten, and more research needs to be done. The history of philosophy is enriched not only by the intellectual accumulation of men, but also by that of women. Even though women philosophers struggled to make their voices heard in the past, their ideas are resonating more and more in today's world. As Simone de Beauvoir said, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman." Re-examining the place of women in philosophy will make this process of becoming more meaningful.